we have a very special guest to speak to us today. So Richard Crawford is the librarian who's in charge of the special collections in the Central Library. We have 3 special collections on the 9th floor, which anybody can go in and look at some of the amazing things that we have here in San Diego. We have the rare book room, we have a genealogy collection, and we have the California room. And I'm not quite sure how many years he's been doing that, but it's been quite a while. He also wrote a column for the UT for quite a few years. It was a weekly column, and he put those together, and we have 2 of his books here. So he had 2 books published that are basically about early San Diego history, and he's going to sign these, and they'll be available for sale at the end of his talk. So he is a wonderful person to have us here to tell us about the impact of Alonzo Horton on San Diego. Richard?
Oh, thank you. Did Catalina tell you she's a docent for us in special collections? She runs the rare book room, covers the rare book room on Monday afternoons.
Mondays 3 to 6.
Yes, yes. So come down. I've been doing this since '82, something like that. I worked for the San Diego Historical Society for about 18 years, and then I've been at the library now for about 18 years. So, and all that time I've been doing that, using collections on California history and specifically San Diego history, I'm always finding great stories. And so several years ago, the Union, San Diego Union, was doing a section called The Way We Were in San Diego. And they had different authors at first, and eventually I was doing that myself. But it was fun to explore topics. And so I did a lot about San Diego, downtown, other areas, all kinds of topics, and it's been a lot of fun. So I covered some of the territory that we're going to talk about tonight. I want to talk about Horton. We've got a lot of Horton around the room, so I'm not going to be exclusively Horton here tonight. I want to talk about Newtown and San Diego through the boom and so forth. So I've got about 40 pictures here, and I'm going to go through them and talk a bit about the story behind the pictures as we go. And some of these pictures will be familiar to you because you've got them, again, around the room. But here's Alonzo at a fairly early age, and we know he was born in Union City, or just Union in Connecticut, and he was one of 7 children, big families in those days, and he grew up mostly in New York State. But at an early age, he was working, as many ambitious, intelligent young men were doing at that time, so he had a lot of different jobs. He was a sailor, he was a clerk, different kinds of merchant activities. And when he got a bit older, he developed a cough, and this is pointed out in one of your captions here. In those days, always got consumption, TB. So the only secret to curing that was to go west. And so west he went, he got as far as Milwaukee, he went to St. Louis, but eventually he ended up in Wisconsin. He had watched his cash very carefully, and he bought land in Wisconsin, and he built his first town. And town building was a very interesting thing throughout the 1800s. It was actually happening a lot throughout the whole century, because the country was developing very, very rapidly, and it was something that very entrepreneurial-minded people did. So he developed the town of Hortonville, and Hortonville that's where it is, and it's still there. It's about 2,500 people in Hortonville today. So he was only there for a short time. I'm sorry?
Just a quick question, I'm sorry. At what age did he do that?
Let's see.
Yeah, because you said 26 is when he got stuff. I just wondered when he was still just a young kid doing that.
One of those questions I probably knew yesterday and I've forgotten already. I don't remember exactly how old he was. Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't.
It was in 47, and he was born in 13.
So you can do the arithmetic.
47 minus 13.
Thank you. 34. All right. And that's Hortonville today. I thought that was kind of fun. It's like a nice place, except it's in Wisconsin where there's a lot of humidity, and
Hasn't changed.
I don't think I could do it. Well, we're going to start with this guy. This is William Heath Davis. William Heath Davis, to the end of his days, said, "No, I'm the father of San Diego. I founded San Diego." And his stake in it was just after the gold rush. I'm sorry, later than that, in 1860. He came to San Diego. He was still a young man. He was 28 years old at the time, and he was quite prosperous, quite wealthy. His family had made a lot of money in trade. He was called Kanaka Bill because his family connections in Hawaii. But he was basically mostly out of San Francisco. But he knew San Diego because he'd been here many times, and he married into the Estudillo family, which was this very prominent San Diego name. So on one of his trips to San Diego, he met up with this gentleman. This is Andrew B. Gray, who was a member of the Boundary Commission, which in 1850 drew the line from Texas to the Pacific, along with the Mexican Commission. And after that was over, Gray, of course, knew San Diego well by that time, and he talked to Davis and convinced him in putting some money into building the town where we are today. And it seemed like a very good idea because we're close to the water down here. Old Town is situated inland on the San Diego River, but it's away from everything. It made sense. So Davis had the money, Gray had the ambition, and several other people got into a partnership. Pedro Reyna, there were about 5 of them all together, but they got together to develop this, but most of the money was coming from Davis. He built a wharf. He got the military to go down and live down there. The barracks were down there, so it looked promising. But things went awry for Davis. He spent a lot of time out of town. People were not moving to San Diego at that time because there were obstacles, even though it was closer to the water. There's no water down here. There's no trees. We'll look at all that more as we go through this. So there were obstacles that were very difficult to overcome. Davis was distracted. He was losing money in other ventures. A steamer came and plowed into the wharf that he built down here, damaged it badly. It never got repaired. Anyway, it all went south, and nobody is down in this place. The San Diego Herald, our first newspaper, the second newspaper in Southern California, started off in Davis Town and gave up and went back to Old Town. Everyone went back to Old Town. So here's Alonzo Horton many years later, or about the time when he discovered San Diego. After his adventures in Hortonville, he had been out to San Francisco. He'd been out to California for the gold rush, like so many other people did. He actually made a little bit of money in California, took it back east, crossed Panama to get back east, lost most of his money in the course of the passage across Panama. He was involved in a riot, actually, in Panama. Several Americans were hurt. He was involved in that, lost a lot of his money. Let's see if I can get the chronology right. He returned east. At that time, he married Sarah, who was his second wife. His first wife had died after 5 years. His first wife, well, you have up forever, Sally Wright. Marriages are interesting. We know of at least 3 wives. There may have been as many as 5. Your exhibit discusses it up here, which it's very interesting. But we don't have good records except on the last 3, anyway. So he married Sarah Wilson in 1860. And in 1862, he's back in San Francisco. And at this time, he's got a store. He's selling furniture mostly and other things. And the story is he heard an interesting lecture in San Francisco one day by someone who just extolled the virtues of San Diego. What a wonderful place this was. And Horton was smitten. And before his wife knew what was happening, he'd sold most of his store and taken his cash and got on the steamer and came to San Diego. So in April 1867, he's in San Diego. The ship comes into the bay, gets into a small boat, gets off the small boat, and gets on the back of somebody to wade to shore. Again, there's no wharf to speak of, no pier. This is how you get to shore in these days. And looks around and likes what he sees. And no one around there could imagine what he was seeing. But he thought this was a perfect place, mostly because of its location of the harbor. So he let it be known that he wanted to buy land. How do I do that? And first person he talked to became good friends with this very important San Diegan. This is Ephraim W. Morse, who was another San Diegan who came via the gold rush. A lot of people came via the gold rush to California and then San Diego. He was a businessman, and he kind of counseled Horton on who to talk to, who was good in town, who was smart, who was valuable to know. And one of the first people they went to was George Pendleton, the county clerk, and says, well, we have to have an auction if we're going to sell you land. And before we can have an auction, we have to have a board of trustees. San Diego was so quiet. We're talking a few hundred people here at best. And the trustees weren't even in office. So the first thing they had to do was have an election to elect their board of trustees. So Horton had a hand in that, along with Morse and other people that he met, including Father Eubach, who advised him on who was good and who was bad. So they elected their trustees. So it was all proper, and they had their auction. And the big bidder, of course, was Alonzo Horton, along with a few other people. And there's a bit of a myth about this. We always say that he bought 1,000 acres or close to 1,000 acres for 27 cents an acre. What he did was he bought about 800 acres at first for $265, and if you do the arithmetic, it comes out to 27 cents. But he bought more land after that, which cost a whole lot more money. He ended up spending about $4,000 on more land after that. So it really comes out like $4 an acre, but we can talk about the 27 cents because it's most of the land he bought initially. But then no sooner did he buy the land, he goes back to San Francisco. And he's not there continuously right away. But he does come back, has a map done. This is the famous Locklean map. You have a wonderful, I didn't realize till tonight that you had a wonderful cloth original copy of this. And this is a fun map for a lot of reasons. It's a nice piece of art. Old maps are just great for that. Here's San Diego, here's Horton's edition. And I always liked seeing North Island as it was. One thing interesting about Horton's development was the size of the blocks. He wanted very short blocks because that gave him more street corners, which are more valuable. He also had no alleys. He thought they were just a place to collect trash. Why waste space on an alley? So that's why in San Diego, I'm used to no alleys in Southern California, but back east I know that's much more common. This is from the Union, a little bit hard to read, but this is in November. So he's bought his land in April and in '67, so we're not very far along here, but already the Union, by the way, has come to town in 1868. We had no newspaper after the Herald. Herald left in 1859. We had no newspaper in town until the Union came in 1868. So right off the bat, they're promoting Horton's edition. We are told that Mr. Horton is selling from $600 to $1,000 worth every day. Restaurants, bakeries, livery, all this. They're really pushing it here. And here it is in late 1869. People are coming by the hundreds by steamer. This is a little bit of hyperbole here. By stage, private conveyance from a place of no importance, home of squirrels, we have 3,000 inhabitants. Maybe 2,500, but anyway, you get the idea. Houses and buildings in every direction. Every steamer averages 200 people. This is Hortons Wharf. This is a later picture, but this was obviously a very important development. We didn't want all our immigrants waiting ashore, and steamers were able to dock. There was another wharf a bit to the left of this, Culverville's Wharf, which didn't go into deep enough water. But this Hortons Wharf did the job because it went out far enough so where the big steamers could dock and bring everything ashore. This would be a very important company along the Pacific Coast, the steamer company, which is based in San Francisco, Pacific Coast Steamship Company. When you came ashore in San Diego, where are you going to stay? And this is our first hotel to speak of. This was a Davis house that Horton bought for $100 from Davis. And Horton sold it sight unseen to Mr. Donnell's. Mr. Donnell's paid $1,000 for a place he'd never seen. He came out here, and the understanding was that this former residence would become a hotel. So Donnell's was on State and F Street. And obviously this wasn't going to be adequate for what Horton had in mind, but this was the start. This is what you had when you first came ashore.
Excuse me, what was State Street?
Well, we still have State Street, don't we?
We still?
Yeah.
I know downtown, that's why I
Yeah.
was slightly confused for a second.
One street removed from Union.
Yeah.
Okay.
A lot of names have changed, but that's not
I
what,
know,
yeah.
and I'm
Yeah.
relatively knowledgeable, it's like,
Yeah.
I'm thinking it back.
Yeah.
That's the current State Street.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, he lived for a time in this building here. We know this. He lived in the Davis house, where Davis never lived. Do we all know this story? Okay. This was a prefab house that came around the Horn, and Davis never got an opportunity to live in it, but Horton lived here for a short period of time until he built his first house, his own first house, on 10th and G Streets. Okay. And here's a picture of Alonzo and Sarah Wilson, who have now both moved. No more San Francisco. They're in town to stay.
And she's wife number.
She's wife number 2, 3, or 4.
Why do you think
We'll say number 2 just to be, because we know.
after her?
Pardon?
How many were after?
Just one after her. Yeah.
She's 4
Okay.
or 3 or 2.
He brought. Okay.
Yeah, I got it.
Horton had siblings, and this is one that came out at that time. This is Lucy Horton, who would marry this man, William Bowers. Bowers would be very prominent, not just in San Diego, but in California. He became a politician. He was a state assemblyman, senator, congressman. So he went a ways politically. But he was a very close associate with his brother-in-law. And one of the first things this guy got accomplished was this. So on January 1st, 1870, they started building this. They built it in how many months? I forget. They don't build quickly anymore like this. I forget. It was less than a year. Less than a year. This is 100 rooms. It was considered, the newspapers called this the finest hotel south of San Francisco. They ignored LA, went right to us. And for the time, it was very nice. And just compare this with Donnell's, which is where you would be staying before this opened.
Wow.
And 100 rooms, as I said, it had amenities like water in the rooms, via pipes from a well. That was a novelty. It had an electric bell system, so you could ring for service. That was, later on, it would be, they would have the first electric light out on the balcony. Much later than this, of course. Still, we got dirt streets. We'll have that for a while. Here's a picture of it later in the 1880s, and there's Horton Plaza. A little bit different now.
Is that the same hotel behind the screen?
Yes, that's Horton House Hotel, still there. Here's Horton Plaza.
Yeah, behind the screen on the wall.
Yes.
Same hotel.
Yes. One very interesting thing about, to say a couple more things about the Horton House Hotel. Horton he's a character from a novel that gets success very early and fairly easily and can't keep it. And this is the first example of this. He never did very well with the hotel. And he managed it for a while, then he gave it to other management. In the late 1870s, this went into receivership for a time. And there's a very extensive court record at the San Diego Historical Society that covers that. And when I worked over there, I had a lot of fun with that case file, Superior Court case file that had all the records. And there's an inventory of every room in the hotel in this, which is just wonderful. And it's detailed down to the contents of the bar, how much glassware they had, what kinds of booze they had at the bar. It's wonderful. And court records are wonderful anyway. But when you find a case file that has all that kind of information, it's really, really fantastic. Eventually, it would go into a man named Hadley would run it for many, many years after Horton gave up on this. But It was for many years the premier hotel in San Diego. And in the 1880s, of course, it's still a very prominent part of San Diego. And one other thing I want to mention here is this is D Street, which is today's Broadway. For a long time, even many years after this, Fifth Street was the equivalent of Broadway. Fifth Street was the main street, not D Street, not Broadway.
Didn't Fifth lead down to the wharf?
Well, yeah.
Okay, that's what I was going to say,
yeah.
yeah, one of the things.
Yeah, it would be the foot of these main streets is where they would have a wharf, yeah. I did an article once on Thanksgiving in San Diego, and this is the menu for the Horton House in what's the date up at the top, 1874, 76, 76. I wish this came in better because it's just a very elaborate menu. The original for this is at the San Diego Historical Society. And when I did the article, I knew it was there because I'd worked there, and I asked them to get the scan for me, and they said, well, our scanner only goes to 8.5 by 11. So tough luck. I thought, you really? So this is actually just a portion that I have. This is Horton's Garden, and let's see, where was this? This was 3rd and B Street. And here, looking in the background, here's obvious problem in San Diego. You had no water, you got no greenery. You look around San Diego today, try to find a native tree. We've got lots of eucalyptus, we've got melaleuca, we've got jacarandas, and none of these are native to San Diego. No palm trees are native. So everything we have was brought in. And he established this garden, and he meant it to be an example. This is going to be a showplace, and he raised all kinds of things here. And this was a close-up of a part of it. He had a German gardener that worked for him for many, many years, and they had thousands of strawberry plants. They had, let me see, I wanted to read a portion of this, which is kind of fun. Louis Stengel was the immigrant gardener, German gardener that came and spent many years there. His garden included palm trees, banana trees, coffee plants, 37 varieties of caladium. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Caladium.
Okay, there you go. Well, they had to explain what that was in here. In parentheses, they say a grand broadleaf plant. They had to tell San Diegans what it was. They'd never seen this before. Poinsettia. They had that. They didn't know what that was until he brought it here. Thousands of strawberry plants. So that was...
But this is several blocks north of...
Yeah. So Horton is developing his city with this kind of thing. He's got the hotel, he's got the wharf, he's showing people how to plant. He's selling land cheaply. He's actually giving away property at times to get people to move here. He's doing whatever he can to keep his city going. This is a very important man, Jesse Shepard, who is not the Jesse Shepard of the Villa Montezuma. Jesse Shepard came from Fort Atkinson, Wisconsin, which is about 100 miles from Hortonville. And he came to work for Horton as his private secretary, as his business manager. And this guy is important not only for the work that he did for Horton. He was actually Horton's most successful years in the early 70s were you can attribute to this guy's management. I mean, he died, unfortunately, very early, fairly young age, but until his death, he worked for Horton. He was also a notary public. He dabbled in real estate on his own, but mostly he worked for Horton. But what's important for us is William Bowers, brother-in-law of Horton, husband of Lucy Horton, gave him as a Christmas gift a little diary book. And for 1 year, and 1 year only, unfortunately, this man kept a beautiful diary. And you don't have enough first-hand accounts of San Diego in this period of time. You got the Union, you've got local public records, you got court records, but diaries are very rare and very precious, which nobody keeps today probably. But anyway, at this time that was very important. The original copy of that is at the San Diego Historical Society, where I learned and used it. So I wrote an article in the Union, and I excerpted a lot of things from this diary. He had beautiful handwriting. It was wonderful to see. But I gave you one quote here from him. He's complaining about the weather, how dry it is here. D Street, Broadway, where the Horton is. Dust and flies flying in all directions. We would have dust blowing all the time. You can imagine what it'd be like with no paved streets, a little bit of wind, totally dry. What else are you going to have? So this is just one example of that. And here's a picture. This is in the late 1870s. You can see how San Diego has been growing very rapidly, but look for all the trees. We still have no greenery to speak of here. That was a long process here, and because we had no water. This is George Marston, a young picture. He's also from Fort Atkinson, Wisconsin. There's this relationship between Fort Atkinson and Horton in San Diego. He came west, worked for a time at the Horton House, but went into business pretty quickly with a store. And this is Marston's first store. Does anyone remember Marston's as a grocery store? Okay, a lot of you do. I talk to people all the time that are younger, have no idea what I'm talking about because they have been gone for a while now. The articles I wrote for the Union, I did over 160 articles, and I think I used Marston's name more than anybody. He shows up for decades, just a very prominent, respected, great guy, and he's just very important in San Diego history.
Where's that located?
Fifth and F.
It's the tiki restaurant now.
Really?
Yeah.
And of course, the Union was very important, and the fact that that got established here was a big deal. Here's the Union office on 6th and F. The courthouse, this was a lovely small courthouse built in the 1870s that lasted until, I think, 1891, 92. Same site as the courthouse today. We've had 3 courthouses where the courthouse is today. And we're going to get to Boomtown here. And this is just a wonderful picture, I think, that shows us a lot. Obviously, extremely busy. This is 5th Avenue. This is their main street still. And I want to point out a few things here. Anyone know what this is?
Streetlight. Streetlight.
It's an arc light street light, yes. Street lights in those days, if you were a big city, it was an arc light. And you had these tall towers, and at the top you would have carbon. I don't want to explain this without getting too much in trouble for myself, but basically you had a light that arced between the carbons, and it would burn all night long for one night. Next day somebody's scrambling up to the top, to replace all this. Yeah. And it cast a huge, very bright light. And cities, really flocked to this in the late 1800s. The problem was it was a very intense light, and they wanted to cover a big area, so it was on tall towers. And it would be placed on intersection areas, spaced throughout the urban areas, not too closely together. We also see, of course, we've got a streetcar system, but we still have dirt streets. A lot of these buildings exist today. We have a wonderful preserved 5th Street today. Now we're going to go back to 1872 again. So this is a fun quote that I like. So Mr. Kitterman is a restaurant man, and people like his place because the flies aren't that bad where he is. I think studying the infrastructure of cities as they're growing is very interesting, looking at lighting, looking at water development, and sewers. Can you imagine without sewers? So at this time in 1872, you don't have a sewer system in San Diego. The bay was your sewer. Everybody understood that, but you had to get to your trash to dump it in the bay. So they could get away with this for many, many years because San Diego was so small. You had a mini boom in the early 1870s. There was always this anticipation of the railroad coming right to San Diego. And eventually it did, much, much later than they thought. It went to San Francisco first, of course, and LA got it before we did. We didn't get the railroad until the mid-1880s. And the boom that we had in 1887 was a boom all throughout Southern California, based on that railroad. Suddenly you're taking the train from Chicago to San Diego for $1, and it was all these promotions. San Diego's population quadrupled in about 18 months, around 1887. So suddenly, and so that's, pardon?
They stayed in tents.
Anywhere, yeah. So this is why you had, this is an example of the boom right here. So we're talking about sewers here, for example, because suddenly we needed a sewer system. This is Colonel Waring, who was a civil engineer. He had a successful career in the military, in the Civil War, fighting for the Union. But after the war, he developed sewer systems, and the Waring system was put into practice in Memphis, Tennessee, where they'd had, used to have, a lot of cities at this time would have horrible epidemics of typhoid and such things, which they blamed on their water system. And so he developed a system which he basically would sell. He would sell his designs to cities. And San Diego hired him to produce plans for a system in San Diego. So this is what they did. Here's San Diego over here. Here's their outlet into the bay. What they did was they developed big sewer lines in the middle of the main streets. And they're all aimed toward the water, the very slight incline downhill from there. And then lateral lines, the people would be, businesses and people would be responsible for paying for themselves. So you had the main pipe going down the middle of the street, and you had lateral lines going into people's houses and businesses wherever it was required. Throughout the city, in various places, just like arc lights were spotted in different places, you had these towers with water that would flush periodically during the day. Imagine a big toilet, and it would flush periodically and send everything downstream to here, where it would go offshore. Forget how many yards it went offshore, 50, 100 yards, I can't remember. But not very far, no, but you had a tower out there that would collect the refuse, the sewage throughout the day. And at nighttime, just when high tide had reached its peak and would start to go out again, a big flap would open up and it would all go out, right? And it would all skate right around Ballast Point and out Point Loma, right? That was the design, and they were extremely proud of this. And of course, there were some complaints. They said, it's not going to wash out. It's going to stay in the bay. But they ignored that. They didn't care. They thought it was wonderful. And if you read William Smythe's book, which was published after the turn of the century, years later, they still were using the Waring system of sewage, and they were still very proud of it. So for their purposes, it did the job. It got the refuse, the sewage, out of the city. I throw this in just as a gift to you all because whenever I do something talking about downtown, people say, I hear Wyatt Earp was in San Diego. What about, So here's Wyatt Earp, and he was here, like so many other people, with the boom and left with the bust that followed in '88. He owned property, he speculated in property, he ran some gambling games, he was a boxing match referee, he could be seen at horse races. He was a presence in San Diego. He didn't do anything terribly interesting. He didn't shoot anybody, didn't do anything like that. The one interesting thing I found, I was looking through the San Diego Union, which is pretty well indexed, but I saw a reference that I'd never seen in the indexing before. And the Union and Tribune, it's all digital now, by the way. If you want to see the really good full-text retrieval indexing, you go to San Diego State and look at it that way. But anyway, San Diego would periodically have these crackdowns on gambling. And there was he ran a faro game near the St. James Hotel. Not the same St. James buildings we have today, but around there. And a policeman went in and interrupted his game, and the quote from Wyatt Earp is something like that, "You stop me, I'll put you in your coffin." So I thought that was a great quote.
So what years was he here?
He was here during the move, 86, 87. I don't know exactly when he left. He was here with his wife. He would go up to LA. He also was up in the Klondike for a while, but he died up in LA in the 20s. So Horton lived for a brief period of time in this house, the Davis house. He had a house a smaller house later on. This is the big mansion. This is the high point of his residences. This was built in 1885, and it was sold in 1892. And it was bought, interestingly enough, to me anyway, by a man named Clifton Maine, who's one of these unknown characters that I've been pursuing for years because he was a very notorious crook. He was in some kind of business deal with Babcock of Coronado fame, and it was trying to bribe city councilmen to vote a certain way on a water issue. But he bought this house. He would later come to bad ends. His wife would leave him. He would leave San Diego. He spent time in prison for trumped up charges, I think, and died in San Francisco. But anyway, he had a long career as a speculator, and he was a pretty sleazy guy. But he lived well at this house for a while. I want to talk to you a little bit, because I work for the San Diego Public Library. You're going to get a little library history here. One of the things Horton wanted to do was, besides promoting gardening and churches and schools and everything he could for his properties, for his city, he thought we ought to have a public library, of course. And he had bought a library, or actually in trade with, who's the San Francisco book? Bancroft. Bancroft, whose name is attached to the Bancroft History of California, he gave in trade, Horton got 1,000 books in exchange for some property. That was the deal. So Horton's got 1,000 books, which he tells everyone he's going to contribute to the library. He's going to contribute this as the nucleus of the first library. And here's an article in the 1870s talking about this. I'll just, if I can find what I'm looking for here. They were talking about the free reading room. Mr. Horton. Okay. Well, anyway, I've got disposable contacts, which probably should have been thrown away a week ago, so I'm sorry. Anyway, he has promised a donation of his library, and when it came time to do this, suddenly he reneged. He was going to give half the books, but then the other half of the books he wanted to sell. And he helpfully suggested that, people can subscribe to the library. They can give you $100 a piece for their share of the book purchases. And this got rejected immediately. They were not interested in that. So they went ahead and developed, there was a Horton Society, Horton Library Association, and that folded when the offer was taken back. And then you had the free reading room, which operated for several years. Horton actually did give up the books, and you had a reading room where people could go. There was no librarian, there was no oversight. Books tended to wander and never come back, so it wasn't very successful. But in 1882, we got our first public library. And see if you can read the window up here. Can you see what that says?
I can't. I cannot.
You cannot. Well, I'd be surprised if you could. It says public library. So this is the Commercial Bank building, 5th and G Street, not too far from us. People know what this building is today? It's a 4-story building now. It was City Hall. Yeah. Has the restaurant been replaced on the main floor yet? It was. Oh, okay. So we rented rooms. The city rented rooms in this bank building. We shared offices with a dentist and the bank, of course, and a grocer. And we were here for several years. This is 1882. This is our first so-called professional librarian. Librarian practice as a profession did not exist at that time. You had people that were educated and went to college, maybe got 2 years of education with an emphasis in library, and that was as close as you could get. So she was fairly well educated and knew what she was doing. She knew the Dewey Decimal System, which is what they really needed. There was a man named Wooster who started off in 1882 and was paid $10 a month to kind of watch the library. This woman was hired for $75 a month to be the librarian. So you had, it was there for several years. Eventually, the building was added on to. The building you see today, the very nicely preserved building that's 4 stories, the library moved up to the top and would be there for several years. There were 2 rooms. You had to have, the sex was segregated for reading in those days. So you had a men's reading room and you had a women's reading room. They were identical. The only difference was the women's room had a potted palm on the floor. So that distinguished the 2. Libraries had closed stacks, which meant you had to go to a staff person to get the book. There was a big rope in front of the stacks. The librarian would retrieve the material for you. They did have a circulating system. You had to be over a certain age. I forget the age. I think it was not 21, but something like 16, maybe only 12. But you had to be that age to check out a book. And there was a fine system. They would charge you a nickel for an overdue book. You had 2 weeks. And they would actually come to your house and get the book and would charge you a quarter if they had to do that.
They
So
had a complete catalog system.
they did have a catalog, and we have her catalog at the library. I should have given you an image of that, but we have a printed catalog that they did. They didn't have a card catalog. They actually had a booklet, which is pretty substantial. They had all the books listed, all in Dewey Decimal. So here's another. This is the last of Horton's wives. This is Lydia Knapp Horton. It was her second marriage. She had a couple sons from her first marriage. And this is her fairly young. This is her later on. And she was very important in San Diego history for a lot of reasons, but mostly for the public library. She was active with the Wednesday Club, which was a group of ladies that took on causes that were of interest to the public and of value to the community, and they would raise money. And one thing she desperately wanted for San Diego was a library. Now, we'd been in the commercial bank building for a while. On the main floor, on the second floor, we got bumped to the 4th floor. Rents got too high, and so the city moved out of there, and they moved to the St. James Hotel for several years. They got booted out of there, and they went to the top of the Keating building for several years. So we kept moving around. And she said, this is ridiculous, we need our own library. Well, Carnegie had just begun donating money to communities. He'd done this a lot on the East Coast, or in the eastern United States. Nothing out west of the Mississippi when we first got interested in this. But she wrote a letter to Mr. Carnegie. This is her little letter. If we pledge to maintain it with our taxes, will you give us $50,000 to erect a suitable library building? And can you imagine some of you have written grants on which, can you imagine writing a letter to a grant writer, and that's what you do, and just that? It sounds really great. And he responded, and he said yes. And eventually he would contribute $60,000 because the cost of our building would go up as we got underway. This is a beautiful Carnegie Library, which we did not keep. This is the same site as the Central Library that we vacated 3.5 years ago on East Street. And this opened in 1892. It had a national bid for construction, and a New York company actually got the bid to build it. They got 5% of the budget. That's how they were paid. And the local contractors who built it was Shepard and Gill, one of our first works done by Shepard and Irving Gill, who was so important in San Diego. So this opened in 1892, and we have many photographs of the library over the years from this view, but this is kind of fun because you got the dirt street, you've got plantings just starting here, the palm trees just starting. You've got, anyone know what this is?
You tie your horse up.
That's right, you tie your horse up, yeah. We have later pictures with the palm trees way up here, and these never disappear. They were there until this library lasted 50 years. It was torn down in the summer of 1952 to build the Central Library that the building that's still there today. And until it was torn down, these were still there. And they, I know a couple of these were sent to the San Diego Historical Society. When I was working over there, I didn't know about that. so I don't know if they're still there. I should ask them. But this was a library that was built for a community of about 17,000 people. That's how small San Diego was. We had the huge boom in '87. We got up to somewhere around 40,000 people. 2/3 of those went away with the bust, and we continued to grow after that, but very slowly. So we had about 17,000 people when this opened. Within 10 years, the population had doubled, and this library was much too small. This is what San Diego does with our libraries typically. We build a building that's for the size of the current population. This is what happened to the old Central Library. When the Central Library over here opened in 1954, the population was about 350,000 people in San Diego. And within 10 years, that had doubled, more than doubled. So hopefully the library that we're in today is taken into account. Hopefully we're not going to double again in size,
The children's library is a couple of blocks up from there, on the second floor.
Yes, and that's what they did to extend the time that they were there. They did various things. There was a big open area when you walked into this building. They roofed that over to get more space. They started moving offices out. The children's library went up the street right here. There's a place called Library Lofts where they were. And actually, what's interesting is where the post office is, there was a building called the Fletcher Building. They picked that Fletcher Building up and they moved it across the street to where the library lofts are. And that's where library offices, including the business offices, cataloging, children's, that's where they were. And then they built the post office where it is today. So they did whatever they could to extend this. They had several bond issues in San Diego. Nobody wanted to vote for a library. We would go through the same experience, fairly recently. So I wanted to show you I showed you the courthouse earlier. Here's the courthouse that came around in, it's 1891 or 92, I can't remember. And I'm going to recognize this again. This is the Horton House in its decline. So I don't have a date for this picture. This has never been published before. This picture came out of a personal album that we have in our collection. And, but it's fairly late in the 1800s, I'm sure. And we get to 1905, and this property has been bought by U.S. Grant Jr. And they're going to tear it down. And Alonzo Horton was still around. He's a very elderly man in 1905. He would only live for about another 4 years or so. And he was there and removed the first brick from the old Horton House. And he was all for what was happening. He wanted to see it gone. It was past its prime. He was with the program. So this was torn down in 1905, and the U.S. Grant Hotel would finally be finished opened in 1910. So here's the U.S. Grant. Here's Horton Plaza. There's a fountain, and this is how it was in 1910.
When it was built.
1910 it opened, yeah. And I think I've gone through all I've got. So you have questions? Thank you. Thank you.
Any questions for Richard? This is your chance.
Yes.
What was the source of the boom in the 80s?
Well, the railroad people got there, and we could promise water a little bit. Water development's a whole different story. I really like talking about water history. Marina Dam had been built, Sweetwater Dam had been built, so now we could promise a water supply, which we couldn't before. But the boom was all of Southern California. It wasn't just San Diego. LA had a huge boom. And it was a boom and bust everywhere in Southern California. You had ghost towns.
So essentially the San Diego boom was just based on
Speculation. It was a bubble.
Promises
Yeah.
of the railroad and
Yes, the railroad had finally.
Hotel Del was 1888.
Kimball Brothers brought the railroad.
Well, they brought it to South Bay. Yeah, they were a huge part of it. But the Transcontinental, we finally got our spur line from the Transcontinental Railroad that came down to San Diego. San Francisco got it much earlier than we did, and then LA got it after they did. It was just this bubble.
Well, Richard, we really appreciate your coming. We
have a little gift for you. You mentioned to us that you had a copy of Bone the Town Dog
Yes.
in the California collection, so we would like to give you another copy that's autographed by Marie Hitchcock.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, I think tonight shows that there's a lot of interest in learning more about San Diego, and we just are absolutely thrilled to have all of you here. Yes,
I'd be
Steve?
interested